Special guest today is a true American and a brother in Christ. Obviously, before Senator Rick Santorum ran for president, he was in the House of Representatives. He was a senator, and more than anything else, I feel, and I just got to meet him today for the very first time, but I feel that he was a man who really championed conservative values, and more even importantly than that, Christian values. Rick Santorum is a true pro-life candidate, but he even goes further than that, in that what I respect and love about him, his stance, the fact that he's willing to get his nose bloodied so many times when it's not popular, is that he's not just a pro-life candidate, he's a whole life candidate. And I see the compassion that he has in the way that he waves a flag for what is right. And so Rick is an incredible leader. He's a best-selling author, New York Times best-selling author, and we're excited to have him in the house today. He was born in Virginia, even though he waves a flag for Pennsylvania. And man, it is just so great to have him. He was telling us backstage that he is the father of 7 children. 7 children. Like a true Catholic, 7 children. Wow. And I told him, I said, man, if your kids would just come to Liberty, we would double our enrollment in one family alone, all right? And so it is just such an honor to have him here, and we are blessed to be able to hear from him. Senator Santorum is battling a flu, all right? So be praying for him as he walks up on stage. But can we just put our hands together for the great Senator Santorum? Thank you, sir.
That's what comes with having 7 children. You're constantly battling disease after disease that comes into your home. So let me apologize for that up front. But I couldn't help but sit here and just be overwhelmed with the mood that's here and the heaviness of this convocation and contemplating the loss of a student here at Liberty University. And I was sitting here and thinking and listening to the hope that I heard in these songs and in the prayer of Josh's prayer. And I thought to myself, you know, how horrible it must be not to have hope, not to have faith, where tragedies don't make sense. I don't know how you make sense out of something like this without faith, without an understanding that God, in His plan, will take care of all these things. I was not always a person of faith. I was always someone who, I went to church, but I was not always a person of faith. I was not always someone who put God in the center of my life. I actually tell a story about how I came to the United States Senate and I found the Lord. Most people don't think He's there, but He is. And I found Him there. And it changed my life. It gave me a whole new purpose to being a United States Senator and to being a public servant. And as I look at the situations confronting our country today, I am constantly reminded of how important that faith is for me in understanding how to address those problems that we confront. It provides a lens from which I look at things that is critical to not only understanding the problems that confront our country, but in providing solutions for those. And what I see in America is that lens is getting cloudier, that we see a decline in people who have that faith. We see, more importantly, in our public lives, fewer and fewer people in public life who are willing to even acknowledge that faith has a role in their decision-making process. We see faith being pushed out of the public square as an illegitimate way of dealing with the problems confronting this country. But see, that is really a very scary thing. Just like here today, without faith, we can't see clearly the crisis that you're dealing with this weekend. And so I would say without faith, we can't see that, not just in other aspects of our life. People ask me all the time, do you bring faith into your work? Do you bring faith into your public affairs? Do you bring faith into your family? And the answer is, I am not one person sometimes and another person another time. Faith is centered to who I am, so of course that is integral to every decision that I make. But in America today, we see faith under assault here at home, and we see an assault around the world. Religious liberty is declining in the world. Powers are rising up to confront America and what America stands for. Or maybe I should say what America has stood for. You see, America is different than any other country in the history of the world. We are the only country in the history of the world that was founded on this ideal. People say America doesn't have a state religion. We don't. Thanks be to God, we don't. But we do have a national creed, and that creed is in our founding document. The most important, I would argue, of all of our documents, even I would argue more important than the Constitution. You see, other countries have adopted our Constitution. Mexico, for example, has adopted our Constitution, did so in 1857. But Mexico didn't adopt our Declaration. And our Declaration is critical for allowing our Constitution to work. Why? Because our Declaration says, and it's most in the heart of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among them life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What does that mean? That means we are the only country in the history of the world that believes rights come to each and every one of you because you are a creation of a loving God. No other country has that credo. No other country has a credo that says you are the holder of rights, and the government's job is not to give you rights, but to protect the rights that you have. And that, okay, decide. That is different. In Mexico, their constitution specifically says government is the purveyor of rights. And in fact, in other countries around the world, it is likewise. And why is this important? Why is this important? Because America has stood as a country full of faith. We are by far the most faith-filled country in Western civilization, and have been for 200 years. Because of our religious liberty, our marketplace of faith that has provided all sorts of incentives for us to go out and preach the gospel in a whole variety of different ways, but to preach the gospel. We are the most faith-filled country. Now, that is declining, and I'll talk about that later. But as a result, we stood and confronted evil. We confronted evil in our own country because of people of faith, motivating us to combat those injustices. And we had the courage to combat evil around the world because we weren't afraid to call evil, evil. Because we weren't afraid to make that judgment. Because we saw it clearly through the eyes of faith. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe that that is changing. I believe that when it comes to the rest of the world, we are no longer as bold in identifying and confronting evil. This month is the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Obviously, very few of you here in this room were around at the fall of the Berlin Wall. I was running for Congress for my first term back in 1989 when that happened. That was a seminal change in world history. Communism had been defeated. The Berlin Wall had fallen, and thus ended a century of bloodshed. You will hear from people say that religion causes more conflict and that we need to get rid of religion in the public square, and we need to get religion out of things because it causes conflict. If you look at the 20th century, look at Nazism, fascism, communism, Japanese imperialism, all atheistic. None of them constrained by God's laws. Simply man's will for power. And 100 million innocent people died, or more, in that century. It dwarfs everything that happened before it. So when someone tells you that religion is a dangerous thing and that faith leads to conflict, point to secularism. Point to man unbridled by moral laws. And there you find true destruction. So what have we learned from that last century? What have we learned from confronting evil? Well, one of the most important things we learned was to identify evil and call it such. To identify the enemy that's before us. Not to play games, euphemisms. Were people offended in Germany when we called the Nazis what they were? Were they offended in Japan or in China or in Russia? Were Russians in this country offended? Possibly so. But we had the courage to tell the truth because the truth was important in shaping the public's response to the threat that was before us. If the American public, we're a democracy. We don't willy-nilly go off to war when a leader says go. We have to be persuaded, as it should be. And unless we are telling the truth to the American public about the nature of our threat, then, ladies and gentlemen, we are not going to be persuasive, and we may pass the opportunity or be too late in confronting a threat that is existential to American liberty. Second, one of the things we learned from the Cold War and the world wars was that democratic capitalism was the best system, was in fact the winner. 25 years ago, a man named Francis Fukuyama wrote an article called The End of History. He said, history will now be the same because democratic capitalism is won. All of these other evils that are out there have failed. And so history is now going to be a rather boring set of expansion of what we know works. Well, that sort of happened in and around 1989. We saw, and in fact, a growth of democracies and an expansion of capitalism. But that has tempered in the last few years. Third, well, in conjunction with democratic capitalism, capitalism is important. Growth is important. But what we also found, and this goes back to the idea that we, in a democracy, in democratic capitalism, you still have to have the public with you. We see when capitalism just benefits few and doesn't provide for a vibrant middle of our country, middle America, that support for any type of stronger military or presence in the world wanes from both Republicans and Democrats. So in fact, to be able to confront evil, we have to have not just a strong economy to be able to afford the weapons we need, but we also have to have a strong public that feels like they are participating in that capitalist enterprise. Third, and this is almost axiomatic, which is we have to have peace through strength. The idea that weakness and negotiations, endless negotiations simply to pander and to appease will bring you peace turned out to be folly in the last century and continues today. And so we do need, absolutely need, a strong military. We also need strong policies to back up that might. We had a policy during the Cold War called mutual assured destruction. That means if the Soviets or the Chinese or whoever acted to attack the United States, that we assured them that we would destroy them if they attacked us. And that worked very well. One of the reasons it worked well was because the leaders of the Soviet Union were atheists. And they believed that once they died, it was over. And so mutual assured destruction worked because they didn't feel like there was anything beyond. Once they died, it was over. Now we are facing an enemy who believes in martyrdom as a desired goal for that afterlife. And where these policies that we have used in the past work against this threat. Lesson 4, America loves a winner. But when it comes to putting American lives at stake, we love patience even more. Again, we're a democracy. We don't like to see, nor should we, our sons and daughters being put in harm's way, and we should be very cautious about deploying those assets. I think Americans are tired of speeches about easy victories. There are no easy victories, particularly when lives are on the line. They expect when we enter into a conflict a clear game plan and a realistic assessment of the time and resources it will take to accomplish the mission. Anything less is inadequate. We need sober reality checks, not pepped up rallies to get people involved in conflicts. Fifth and final, and that's a lesson we have learned, that Western civilization, as it becomes more secular, it has and will become more insular and much more willing to tolerate and compromise with evil. We see it. We see so many countries around the world who are willing to give evil a pass, willing to negotiate just so they don't come after them. Why? Because they have lost their own sense of purpose and meaning. They simply are worried about themselves, just like the Soviets of a generation ago. If all you worry about is the here and now, you don't worry about the future or what's right or wrong. You're not driven by moral laws and a sense of principle and purpose. Then you make all sorts of deals to protect yourself. In other words, America increasingly is going to be going it alone. That is maybe the strongest and most important lesson that we have learned. So let's examine where we are today, how we have applied the lessons of the last century to the world today. Well, let's look at our age-old foes of Russia and China. They have both learned that democratic capitalism actually did work, and that it did defeat the Soviet Union, and it put China in a position where they had to change. China now has their own form of capitalism. Russia, thanks to petrodollars, has not changed much, but at least now, because of the energy resources they have been able to continue what they did in the last century, which is to ally with countries like North Korea and Iran and Syria, to create instability, to oppose the United States at every turn. Those two countries have not changed much, except that they had to adapt to provide the resources to continue the confrontation with the West. And of course, we have another threat, and this has emerged since the Cold War, but it's certainly not a new threat. Unlike atheistic communism and Nazism, this threat is rooted in a belief in an all-powerful God and has over 1 billion adherents who are taught that their faith supersedes all other faiths. In one form or another, Islam has been warring with Western civilization for 1,300 years. I encourage you to read your history. We're a very young country, and as a result, we tend to look at things in a very small window of a few hundred years. We can't afford to do that, particularly now. We have to understand the historical aspects of the threat that we are facing. Professor Bernard Lewis of Princeton has termed the phenomena as Islam's bloody borders over the past 1,300 years. Now you say, well, this is a new phenomenon, just since the events of 9/11. But for 1,300 years, until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in World War I, for most of those 1,300 years, Islam was on the advance, pushing forward, not evangelizing with the word, but evangelizing with the sword. That is the method of expansion, and it continues with these radical Islamists today. With respect to this enemy in Rule 1, which is to identify the enemy, both Presidents Bush and Obama have failed. They violated this first rule. They identify the enemy by what they do, not by who they are or what they want to accomplish. They've denied a connection between Islam and groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS and a host of other violent groups. Let me just be clear. I'm not saying that all Muslims are terrorists, nor do I say that all Muslims support terrorism. But we have an obligation to face the truth about who the enemy is and what they want to accomplish to have any chance of defeating them. You need only listen to what they say to determine who they are. They believe that they are the most faithful of Muslims because they adhere to the tenets and teachings of the original founders of Islam, the people who lived at the time of the Prophet. When I was in the Senate, I spent a lot of time confronting this historic threat, calling out President Bush to better define the enemy and their motives. I sponsored and passed, actually, 2 bills, the Syrian Accountability Act and the Iran Freedom Support Act, both of which were opposed by President Bush and later passed by bipartisan majorities with the president's signature. In the summer of 2006, out of frustration, I actually gave a speech, this was my last year in the Senate, to the National Press Club, challenging the president to identify the roots of radical Islam. I gave this story and I said that the president needs to call the Islamists either radical Muslims or Islamic fascists. I actually brought the speech to his office 2 days later and handed it to him personally and said, Mr. President, we are losing the war in Iraq because the people don't know why we're fighting. We need to identify this enemy of Al-Qaeda and its related groups, who they are and why they're a threat to the future of the world. A few days later, there was a terrorist incident that was aborted, and someone asked the president at a press conference about it, and he used the term that I used. He called them Islamic fascists. My phone rang off the hook. All the press called me and said, has the president changed? Did you finally convince him? It turned out that was the last time he used it. The people over in the State Department, the vast majority of which are not people of faith, are not people who understand and look at the world through the eyes of how people can be motivated by faith to do such things. And unless we understand that faith and the motivation behind it, we will never ultimately be able to dissuade it or destroy it. They persuaded the president to never say those words again, and he never did. As difficult as it was to convince this president, it's even more difficult for President Obama to handle. To call the Fort Hood shootings and the beheading that took place in Oklahoma, workplace violence issues. Not only is it denial of reality, it makes us look weak, it makes us look delusional and foolish. By not correctly identifying these Islamists for who they are, two of our presidents have given all Muslims a pass. They've given them a pass in confronting a cancer that is within their body as Muslims. There are many in the Islamic world that understand that cancer, but we don't help them treat that illness when we refuse to identify that their body is sick. This strict form of Islam is growing in the Middle East and is spreading, as we see now with ISIL after the events of the last few months. We also realize that it doesn't take an army division to invade America to be a threat to our country, which leads another threat, Iran. Again, the president has refused to identify the clear reality. Iran is developing a nuclear weapon. There's no other reason for them to be doing what they're doing. It is clear, it is obvious, and the president continues to deny that reality and believes he can negotiate some sort of accommodation. Those negotiations come to an end at the end of this month, November 24th, and I fear we may end up with something similar to what Bill Clinton negotiated with North Korea. When North Korea was pursuing a nuclear weapon and he got a deal to stop them, a few years later they set off their first nuclear weapon. When a country is determined to develop a nuclear weapon to protect their regime, no piece of paper will stop them. Only action will stop them. That is something we learned from the last century, and we are not applying to today. Democratic capitalism is winning, but it's not winning as good as it should. Yes, we had a surge in democratic capitalism, but now it's on the decline. And we have a question that we have to ask ourselves. Yes, capitalism is good, and we're for that, and we believe that it will liberate and grow the economies of the world and provide a better life for those in the world. But the issue of democracy has come into question. We've seen from the events in Israel with Hamas, we've seen with Egypt, we've seen with Iraq, that democracies, elections, I should say, in countries that are not prepared for elections is not a good idea. Democracy should be the ultimate goal for all countries, but not an urgent necessity to prove that we've won. Democracies don't work everywhere. It takes time. Even in our own country, we didn't have the democracy we have today when our country was founded. It took time. It takes time, particularly in the Muslim world. We had a great petri dish here in America to develop a democracy. That is not the case in a world, particularly in the Middle East and the Muslim community. The third lesson that we are applying is peace through strength. Obviously, the president has turned that one on its head with his idea of leading from behind, cutting the Defense Department drastically. We are now spending less on defense than at any time since the Great Depression. America is no longer strong, can no longer take on the responsibilities that it has. I believe in limited government, but I don't believe in small government in the areas where government is the only one to do the job. In the case of national security, we need a robust and strong military. I could give a whole speech on how the president has messed up our rules of engagement and how to engage, that America loves a winner and wants us to engage in conflicts we can win. I want to use the most recent example of ISIS, where we are engaged in a conflict with no intention of winning. We're not devoting the resources. We have no game plan. The president simply wants to show the American public that he's trying. That's not enough. If we engage our men and women in uniform, we engage to win, period. And this president doesn't want to win. And finally, and most importantly, Mark Stein wrote a book a few years back called America Alone. And he talked about how because of the increasing secularism in the Western world, when I say the Western world, the world of the Bible, the Judeo-Christian world, because of that increasing secularism, America is increasingly going to be alone. Here's the concern, ladies and gentlemen, that secularism is creeping here. We have seen a direct assault on religious liberty like we have never seen in the history of this country. We only need to look to what went on in Houston just a few weeks ago. The intimidation that government is now trying to keep people of faith out of the public square. If you look at polls, the Harris poll, just in the last 8 years, we have seen a decrease in the number of people who say they believe in God from 82% down to 74%. And worse yet, less than half of the people in this country believe in the devil and evil. If you don't believe in God and you don't believe there is evil, then where comes the fortitude to stand up and fight for good against evil? Most of the European secular countries have abandoned ship when it comes to fighting for good and confronting evil. People always ask me when I lay out the situation confronting America, what can we do? And the answer is very simple. Do something. You here at Liberty are in a unique position to do something. America will not be strong, not just in confronting evil overseas and protecting our liberty here at home, but America will not be strong unless we confront the forces of rabid secularism here in this country. We need to push back, and ladies and gentlemen, we're not. If you look at the situation and how America has progressed, when I was your age, they actually had Bibles in schools. No more. Why? Because we let it happen. Oh, you can say, well, the courts pushed them out. You know what? When the left loses a court's decision, when the secularists lose a court decision, they're back in court the next day. They don't give up. They fight. They want to transform this country into something unlike the American Revolution, a revolution based on God-given rights, to something more like the French Revolution, a country based on government-given rights. The model of Europe is a descendant of the French Revolution. The European Union, the godless European Union, is a descendant of that revolution. That is the battle here in this country. It's an existential battle, not just for the heart and soul of America here, but for America's ability to be able to stand up and fight for good, to be that symbol, that beacon of hope, of goodness and morality, standing for God and His laws to the rest of the world. My charge to you today, take the fire that I know is here, nurture it, understand it, be smarter, understand your religious liberties, understand what it means. I'm the CEO of a company called Echo Light Studios. And we just produced a movie called One Generation Away. I encourage Liberty to show that movie. It's an hour-and-a-half documentary that once you leave there, you will be schooled as to how we are in, why we got into the situation we are in, and how to intellectually confront those who want to continue to transform this country. We need you not just to support each other, but we need you to be evangelicals, yes, for the faith, but just as importantly, for what makes the faith alive here in this country. And that is the doctrine of religious liberty. Thank you all very much, and God bless you.